It's not a matter of huge significance that Putin has won this election, because elections come every 5 years. They're just a periodic time when people have a right to go to the ballot box and cast a vote. Putin is re-elected and his future is secure, at least in the short term. I don't think it's quite as clear-cut as it may seem. So there was no obvious opposition to Putin at all. No organized political opposition of any substance. There is a minority that thinks it's time to change Putin, and we've seen occasionally demonstrations in different ways and right across the Russian Federation. But at the same time, it's not been enough to bring about any real change. In Ukraine, there's outrage because some of the elections took place on occupied Ukrainian territory, and Ukraine is bitterly opposed to the election. Well, I think the elections are really something of a facade for Putin to stay in power. They're a way to legitimize his rule. But I think if you look over the long period of Putin's presidency, these are probably the least fair elections in the entire period. There's really no opposition candidates. And the opposition candidates, for example, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which has always run against Putin since 2000, this time got 4%, whereas in the past their percentage has always been in double figures at least, and usually around 25-30%. So I think this time there's really no opposition, and opposition candidates were either not allowed to run, or like Alexei Navalny, they were dead, they'd already died. So there was no obvious opposition to Putin at all. No organized political opposition of any substance. I also read that 80 people were arrested during the elections, often for forming lines outside election offices in protest against the elections, but also in remembrance of Alexei Navalny. These were not significant enough to offset the general opinion that Putin remains popular in Russia, and clearly people don't see an alternative to Vladimir Putin as president. And that's fairly logical, I think. Russian media is controlled by the Kremlin. Social media in particular has been very effective in getting the Kremlin's point of view across the nation. And therefore, it's not surprising to me that as long as there's no great economic crisis in Russia, and quite clearly there isn't, despite the fact they're at war, then Putin will remain popular. So I would suggest that if there had been an open and fair election with an opposition allowed to mount a credible campaign, it's likely Putin would have won the election anyway. But I don't think he would have won with something like 87%, I believe you said at the beginning, is an unrealistic figure in any democratic election. I mean, this is a sort of one party state type of election where people are getting those kinds of figures. It's really a matter for Putin's long-term security, because for the West it means now they've got to deal with Putin for a minimum of 6 years, providing he stays alive for 6 years, and with the possibility of a further 6 after that. So between now and 1236, Putin is likely to be the leader of Russia if he's living. And you've got, I think, a situation where Putin's Russia is getting more and more anti-Western and more belligerent, and quite capable of carrying out acts of aggression against neighbors without really any caveats. There's nothing really to stop them doing that. And Putin may seem also to be very securely in power now, and with nothing really to prevent him doing what he wants. But on the other hand, I don't think he's quite as secure as it may seem. I mean, it's only a matter of 7 or 8 months ago that there was a major attack on the Kremlin from Gennady Prigozhin with a group of soldiers which captured the town of Rostov. And although that came to nothing, although some compromise was made that ended that rebellion, it does show how easily it is, I think, in Putin's Russia for something like this to happen. So although he seems to be absolutely secure now, and the West is faced with the prospect of Putin in the indefinite future, I don't think it's quite as clear-cut as it may seem. On the other hand, I think it also shows that the West, if it wants to gain any traction with Russia, has to be unified, has to come up with clear policies, and has to be committed to them for the long term. So if they want to preserve Ukraine, for example, they have to provide Ukraine with weapons to keep the war going in the longer term. And this is the situation facing the United States now on the eve of its own election, and a very contentious one coming up, which really could change, I think, the balance of forces around the world. I mean, Russia is not a democracy. It's not really been a democracy in any way since, say, the mid-1990s, and it's not anything different for them. It's not a matter of huge significance that Putin has won this election, because elections come every 5 years. They're just a periodic time when people have a right to go to the ballot box and cast a vote, or in this case they can do it electronically as well. This is a ritual. It's become a ritual. So for Russians, nothing has changed, and they won't be completely dissatisfied with that either. This is something that most of them are accepting. There is a minority that thinks it's time to change Putin, and we've seen occasionally demonstrations in different ways and right across the Russian Federation. But at the same time, it's not been enough to bring about any real change. But in the neighboring states, most of them have problems with Putin in power. They're very afraid of what may happen, particularly I would say the Baltic states and neighbors like Russia, but neighbors of the region like Poland and the Caucasus would be quite worried by this election and what it might mean for them. In Ukraine, there's outrage because some of the elections took place on occupied Ukrainian territory, and Ukraine is bitterly opposed to the election. And in Belarus, which is probably Russia's closest partner in the neighborhood, I think that there are really two Belaruses, because there's official Belarus. Lukashenko won his own election in 2020 in very dubious circumstances, but retained power. The regime in power is satisfied with Putin back again. It has worked with Putin. Putin has protected Lukashenko. But I think there's a sector of society and Belarusians in exile who are not happy with his continuing rule. So the world is quite divided, I think, and the opinion on Putin is very divided. But in the immediate neighborhood, Russians are reasonably happy. The rest of the neighborhood, not so much.